Good evening. Thank you for showing up this evening. Tonight, we have Dr. Karen Kolkazi from West Virginia University. She's going to be talking about the Syrian refugee crisis, Syrian women refugees in Jordan. I think we're very fortunate to have Dr. Kolkazi here at GRCC. She has done an ample amount of field work in the Middle East, and she's really contributed to the field of geography and to scholarship, really, in across the social sciences, especially with regard to some of this more recent research. We have an award to give Dr. Kolkazi. It is the GRCC Geography Field Cap Award.
It's been sitting in the car last few days. I've been wondering. I've been kind of hoping for this.
Oh, there you go. This Field Cap Award is given to visiting geographical scientists.
Great,
Dr. Kolkazi is one of 43 distinguished visiting geographical scientists that are listed by the International Geographical Honor Society and the American Association of Geographers. I'll ask you now to direct your attention to Dr. Kolkazi as she begins her talk.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm usually pretty loud, so. And please call me Karen. He keeps referring to me as Dr. Kolkazi, but I go by Karen. So, and thank you for coming tonight. I know that coming to a talk at 6:30 after dinner is kind of insomnia time, so I appreciate staying. You all look pretty alert, too, so that's a good thing. So I'm just going to get right into it, and I'm actually going to go a little bit backwards. I'm going to start with my subtitle, and I'm just going to start talking not about the Syrian refugee crisis, but I'm just going to tell you about a particular Syrian woman I met, and then I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit and go into like the broader picture of it. But I'm just going to get right into the stuff here. In the summer of 2014, I began field work with Syrian women refugees in Jordan. I had done research in Jordan in the past with Palestinian refugees, so I was able to actually kind of move into this project relatively easily. One of the first women I interviewed when I was in Jordan in the summer of 2014 was this woman who is pictured on the left of the photograph. Her name is Fatima. It's a pseudonym. It's not actually her real name, but I'm going to call her Fatima. Fatima, I photographed her here, and the same day I interviewed her. She's 19 years old. Her son is the little one that's kind of pink, being held by the woman that's to her right, which is actually her sister-in-law. I talked with Fatima for quite a long time. I talked with Fatima about how she got to Jordan from Syria, what she experienced crossing the border, how her life was for those few days trying to get across the border, and then getting to this. She's in a refugee camp called Zatri. I'll talk more about Zatri in a few minutes. But this photograph here, she's actually in a trailer area of Zatri refugee camp. And when I talked to her, I also got to meet her family as well. The man to her right is actually her father-in-law, and you can see he's holding a child. That's one of her nephews, or niece, in fact. Fatima was amazing. Fatima blew me away. 19 years old, she's a mother for the first time in her life. She fled Syria. She fled from Deraa, which is in the very southern part of Syria, into Jordan for her safety, for her life, because there's a civil war going on there. When she came, she was with her husband, and she was pregnant at the time. Her son hadn't been born at that time. And she gets to Jordan, and she actually did not go immediately to the refugee camp. She went to an urban center where she actually was kind of, and her family as well. They were technically living illegally for a short amount of time. It became so difficult for them, however, to survive there because of the cost of living and because they didn't have their network and work and they're established. They didn't really have a stream of income, that they were forced to actually go into the refugee camp to seek aid from different aid organizations, and there are literally dozens and dozens of aid organizations working in these camps. It's a very difficult decision for her and her family to do, but they go there. And then she gives birth to her son. And in the dire circumstances of being a displaced person, of being a refugee, and when she went into the camp, she was officially registered as a refugee through the UN. When she ends up in the camp, she has a child, but because of those dire circumstances, her husband decides he has to leave the country to find work. So for the first 2 months when their son was born, her husband actually took care of the child, and Fatima worked for the first time in her entire life. She began to work as an assistant to one of the schools. She wasn't a teacher, she was an assistant to the teacher in the Zatri refugee camp. Her husband went to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and he began to work in the oil industry there in order to send remittances or money back to their family here. It was a very, very difficult time for her, and she talked about this time in her life clearly with an incredible amount of stress and a credible amount of sorrow. She has, and that's what I want to highlight today, a lot of challenges. I'm going to give you 2 quotes here. I know there's a lot of words up here, but I'm going to highlight the really important aspects of them. She has an immense amount of challenges facing her, okay? This only highlights a few things. There's trauma, there's psychological damage that I'm not even gonna get into here. But she talks first about finding medical care, because she just had a child, okay? And she said the hospitals are very hard to get to. They're very difficult to get into. And I can attest, this was not unique to Fatima. This is the case for Syrian refugees throughout Jordan. Water as well. This is a very arid area of the world, and water can be very difficult to find. Even if you own a home and you live in an apartment building, water can be very difficult to find. She found that food was not very clean. It was often literally covered in dust, because there is a lot of dust from the sandstorms and such in the area. She worried particularly about mice. In the Zatri refugee camp, they had a huge mice problem. The UNHCR, which is the organization of the UN that runs the camp, they were able to somehow exterminate the mice, but nevertheless, for a long time, she lived with constant kind of concern about the mice crawling all over the place. Bathrooms are public in the refugee camp, and that basically means for a woman, and for men as well, they have to actually go elsewhere to use the bathroom. You lose your privacy. You lose some sense of dignity over long terms using only a public bathroom. And for women particularly, that can be very difficult when they're living in a patriarchal society, because when a woman leaves her actual home and she leaves to go to a bathroom where she could be undressing or unclothing, it's actually in some ways considered, makes them very vulnerable. Okay, to actually be bathing in public frequently. So getting to the bathroom was a huge issue for her. And even just to walk for a long time in order to drink or to wash up to get that water to use the bathroom. And these are struggles that maybe we don't even think about. You think, how often do you think about a refugee worrying about mice, right? But this is her daily life. This is her reality. And then something maybe will resonate with you as students, particularly. She lost her opportunity to go to school. When the war broke out, she was 19 when I met her. She had been in the camp for about a year. She had just finished high school, and she told me about how one of the things that she really bemoaned the most, one of the things that she really was struggling with, was the fact she didn't get to go to college. And she continues to tell me, she said, I had high hopes about getting into college because I was excellent in certain subjects. And later she tells me what she really wanted to do was become a teacher. I wanted to go into grad school and even get my master's and my doctorate as well. Like, she had these aspirations, and she was wanting and planning on doing this in Syria, but a war broke out, and her entire future basically changed because of that war. So as much as her, in a lot of ways, her immediate circumstances were quite dire, and her future looked rather bleak, there were actually such amazing things about Fatima as well. She exhibited such incredible resilience and so much strength. It was mind-blowing to me. It was so humbling to me. It was such an important thing to me as well, as kind of to reflect about how well I really have it. So I mentioned before that she when she first got there, right when she had her son, her husband took care of their son at first because she got a position being a teacher's assistant in one of the schools. Now this is one of the education complexes in the Zatri refugee camp, where they have all these trailers set up here. And each one of these trailers is basically one room, and they'll teach maybe 8, maybe a dozen kids. And what they've also done, you can't really see it in this picture so well, but they've actually welded together some of these trailers to make kind of larger open classrooms. And so they have classrooms that will fit about 25 students in them. So she first started working in one of these as an assistant, but she very soon got promoted. She got promoted to 2 different levels. And by the time I met her, she was a 2nd grade teacher. So she was in some ways able to fulfill this dream that she had. She wasn't able to go to college, but she wanted to go to college and become a teacher. And she was able to do this. Now, no one wants war and displacement to create opportunities for you. You hope they're going to actually arise in your normal environment. But in this particular case, Fatima had such a sense of ingenuity and such a sense of strength that she was able to overcome these unbelievable obstacles, these emotional, psychological, and actually very material obstacles. And she was actually able to achieve a lot of what she wanted to do. And what this also then, her working had a huge effect on her social relationships with the people in her family. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Back there. She felt as though she was making a difference in her community. Okay? She says, I feel now, talking about her teaching specifically, teaching 2nd graders, that I help others. And I think teachers feel this way in general. Okay? First, I was doing nothing with my life, but now I feel more productive. I'm helping my family because she has an income through teaching. Okay? She's getting paid to do this work. It's not volunteering. And I'm helping the less fortunate, and I'm helping the children. So part of this project I was doing, Fatima was one woman I interviewed. I interviewed a total of 51 women, but I had a lot of other casual conversations with women. I had conversations with men as well. I had a lot of conversations with aid workers, and this type of sentiment was repeatedly told to me. I heard this time and time and time again, that the ability that the strength that a lot of women showed, these refugee women showed, in order to get a job, meant that their relationships which are changing the community, that they had the sense that they were doing something productive. They had the sense that they were actually making life better. And when you're working with Syrian refugee children, this is the population of people that do need support. They need nurturing. They need help, perhaps more than not refugee children. So she felt very productive. And it also affected her relationship with her family. Just to go back to this picture here, while she was working as a second grade teacher, her father-in-law ended up taking care of their son because her husband's in the UAE working. So it was actually her father-in-law who was taking care of the son. That is something that would not typically happen in a patriarchal society that did not just experience displacement. Their gender roles were shifting and changing. And a lot of my research actually really focused on the shifting of gender roles. I'm not going to talk about that too much today because it's kind of another topic in some ways. But there are these immense kind of reconfigurations going just on gender roles in a lot of these families and a lot of these households. All right. Okay. So the context, all right? So I started here with my subtitle, but now I want to move to the context. That how is it that Fatima was scared of mice for so long, and that mice affected her for so long, and that she was then able to have this immense amount of strength and confidence in what she was doing. And it happened because of war. Okay? And of course, we don't want this to happen. It's not a reason. We don't want our opportunities to arise because of war. But it's still an amazing thing to document and to show that when these moments of crisis happen and how people can overcome them, it is such a testament to people's strength and ingenuity. So just real briefly, I have basically one slide here. I just want to kind of provide a little context about the Syrian refugee crisis, less so than the women that I met. Perhaps a lot of you are aware of what's been going on in Syria since 2011. This should have come up here. So part of the broader Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia in the very, very end of 2010, there was a movement throughout a lot of Arab countries and other countries as well, but it did predominantly happen in Arab countries, that after decades and decades of having very authoritative leaders, living in very oppressive societies where people did not have a lot of liberties or a lot of freedoms, people began to revolt and uprise. It begins in Tunisia, it then moves to Egypt and Libya, and it does happen in Syria as well. And to each of these countries, it happens at different levels of success and violence, and I'm not going to get into the details of that. But the Arab Spring does come to Syria, and it comes in March of 2011, about 3-4 months after it had begun in some other countries. The people who are rising up in Syria are rising up against the Assad regime. You probably have heard the name Bashar al-Assad many times in the news over the last 6 years now. The Assad regime had actually been in power in Syria since 1970. Since 1970, there had been only 2 leaders in Syria, Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez. And that is all. And they ruled with a very authoritative hand, to say the least. It was a very oppressive society. People did not have a lot of freedoms there. Now, compare that to Egypt. I would say that people had a lot more freedoms in Syria than they did in Egypt. But nevertheless, they still were relatively oppressed. So the uprisings began. So the photograph of the town of Dara, which is actually the town that Fatima was from. This is where the uprisings began in March of 2011. And because in some ways Syria was considered to be a little bit less authoritative than other countries in the Arab world, there was a sense from, I don't know, the international community, from academics, from political scientists, from political geographers, that the Assad regime was actually going to acquiesce, kind of give in to the uprisings, kind of like Egypt and what Mubarak did in Egypt. But they didn't. And it was actually much to the surprise and then the horror of the world that they did not. And I'll never forget the day. It was just about a week and a half after the uprisings began in Dara, that Bashar al-Assad got on TV and he basically made the announcement that he was going to fight back and retaliate. And it was shocking to hear this. And he did. And we are still today, we are seeing the war that resulted. Okay? What is happening now in Syria is the result of Bashar al-Assad retaliating against the uprising that happened in Dara in March of 2011. What has happened since then, I've taught a half a semester course on what's happened since then. It's complicated. There's a lot going on here. But by that summer, Syria was pretty much in a full-scale civil war. That civil war soon became a regional war. It became a war involving Iraq, and then ISIS evolves out of that. It's a war that involves Iran and Russia and the United States to a teeny tiny little degree, but other countries come involved in supporting certain sides of the regime. When it first began, it was pretty clear to say that it was the Assad regime and the established military branch versus what became known as the Free Syrian Army. Okay? But the Free Syrian Army ended up splintering and dividing and splintering and splintering. And now to actually label the different factions and the different groups fighting this war is incredibly difficult to do. When I say they splinter into many groups, I probably should have said dozens and dozens of groups. It's very difficult to even say who's fighting who now. It's incredibly complicated kind of geopolitics happening there now. The statistics on this, well over 400,000 Syrians have died. That includes military and civilian. Okay, and that's statistics from, I needed to update this. That's statistics from October, okay? And if you were kept kind of aware of the news earlier this winter, you know that there was a siege of Aleppo, largest city in Syria. And that that number does not take into account how many people died in Aleppo. But I mean, obviously, this is a staggering number of people. So the refugee crisis comes out of the war. All right, there's a difference between the war and the refugee crisis. So this context of understanding a little bit about the war, I think it's important to understand the actual refugee crisis. The crisis, then, is really a regional crisis. I'm calling it the Syrian refugee crisis, but it is very much a regional crisis. And it's happening in a handful of countries that we see here. The stat from the UN as of about a week ago was that there were 13.5 million refugees. Now, what a refugee is compared to a displaced person, to an asylum seeker, to somebody seeking temporary status, is a very complicated legal argument, right? So to try to, what I say when I'm using the term refugee or displaced person, I'm using it actually in I'm going to keep it in a very general term, in a very general way. It's a person who, because of the war, was forced to leave their home. Okay, that's not the legal definition of it. There are nuances and differences there, but that's how I'm taking it to mean for this talk today. A displaced person or a refugee is somebody who's forced to leave their home because of the war. Okay? This number, however, actually only reflects people who have officially registered with the UN. So the way I think about a refugee is actually much broader, and there's much more of them than 13.5 million. The UN also does what I've come and done and say, okay, well, we recognize that not every single refugee is registered with us, so they have another estimate, and their other estimate is 22 million. Okay? They can't really document that. That's an estimate. Right? So most of the Syrian refugees are either in Syria. We call those in Syria internally displaced people. If they're not in Syria, and it's about 6 million of them, these are the official ones, 6 million of them are actually still in Syria. The rest of them are in the neighboring countries. They're in Turkey. Turkey has taken over 2 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon has taken a little over 1 million, which actually Lebanon is a very small country, does not have a very large population. Syrian refugees now constitute a quarter of Lebanon's entire population. Right? Pretty dramatic. So Turkey has the most, Lebanon has the second. Jordan then has the third, which we'll talk more about Jordan later. Egypt has taken in a little over 100,000, and then Iraq has taken in over 200,000 Syrian refugees, which if you've been following anything going on in Iraq, you also know that Iraqis are fleeing Iraq to seek refuge in other countries. Okay? So there's a very complicated kind of refugee movement happening here. And perhaps it's not, maybe it's really obvious to say this, but to be a refugee is something you don't want. Nobody ever thinks they're going to be a refugee. No one wants to be a refugee. You lose your home, you lose your livelihoods, you lose your job, you lose your education. It is not a good predicament to be in. This is a photograph of an aid organization that got into Aleppo during the siege just a couple months ago. And of all the media I read about, and I read all the news about this, this image particularly really had an impact on me, so I thought I'd share it with everybody here. As you can see, that utter desperation, that the fear, that look in those men's faces to get food here, to get this aid, because they have been they were starving to death. And that sense of this, such a desperate need to get this food. I mean, it kind of, in a lot of ways to me, that image really, in some ways, it illustrates how difficult it must be to be a refugee, particularly in Aleppo case. We hear about the Syrian refugee crisis. For me, it's odd. We hear about it in the context of Europe, sometimes the United States. The Syrian refugee crisis is a crisis that's happening in Syria, it's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Lebanon, it's happening in Jordan. It's not really happening so much in Europe. When people talk about the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, they're talking about Europeans. And I think that's a very different topic. And it's a terminology, it's a discourse, but I think it's an important one to correct a bit. So in the summer of 2015, not quite 2 years ago now, if you're following the news, you know that there had been the number of Syrian refugees trying to approach Europe increased dramatically. And it increased not only dramatically, but it happened very tragically. Okay? There started being numerous cases being documented, bodies being found, boats were being capsized in the Mediterranean. This was a photograph just from Friday of another boat that capsized of Syrian refugees. They had just left Turkey. They were trying to get to Greece, but they barely made it like 10 miles off of Turkey's coast before it capsized and they died. The tragedies were just so numerous. And I think probably the one that was perhaps the most horrible and the most memorable was Aylan Kurdi. And his image was a 2-year-old boy, a little toddler, who was on a boat with his family trying to seek refuge in Europe, and the boat capsized, and he drowned, and then his body washed ashore. I was not going to put that image up there because it's so gut-wrenching and horrible, and I didn't want to go there with that. But that image of Aylan Kurdi, it created a lot of sympathy. And in fact, humanitarian organizations, the UNHCR being one of them, and an organization that I've actually worked with in Jordan, they saw their donations skyrocket. Right? So the death of this 2-year-old, this tragic death of this 2-year-old boy, in some ways had this incredible effect of increasing donations to these aid organizations. But this refugee crisis that happened in Europe, again, in a lot of ways, it became about Europeans, not so much about the Syrian refugees. It became a debate in Europe about what they're obligated to do out of humanitarianism, out of law. The humanitarian law is enshrined in humanitarian kind of obligations are enshrined in laws, but also just enshrined in ideology and beliefs and religious systems. There's a lot of ways we get this idea of what humanitarianism is. And they have these incredibly polarizing debates about what you need to do to be a human being and to care for another human being versus what you need to do to keep your culture and your society the way it is without change. And we see those debates happening in the United States as well. Okay? But this is where the idea of the Syrian refugee crisis came from. It came out of how Europe reacted to Syrians trying to get to their borders. And that's why I started with that other slide, saying the crisis is actually really happening. It's happening somewhere else. The numbers are, the statistics show that what is happening in Europe. It's not a crisis about the Syrians. It's a crisis about the debates and the politics that's happening in Europe. It's actually well less. It's actually about 820,000 Syrians have tried to reach Europe. Okay, and that's a big number. I mean, no doubt. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. But when you realize that the population of the EU is 508 million, that actually represents 0.2% of the entire EU's population. Right? So people have made arguments that in Europe their culture is going to change if they accepted all these refugees, but we're talking 0.2%. That's not going to be a major seismic shift in cultural change here. So there's been this big debate in Europe, and as I'm sure you're probably well aware, it's also happening in the United States. Right? But it's absolutely fundamentally different, and I'll get to that in my next point here. So we've been having this happening here in the United States. Fall of 2015, a couple months after this is really going on in Europe, Americans begin to kind of reflect on this and kind of understand where our positioning in the world and how we might be related to the refugee and the resettlement process here. And it becomes very controversial here. Early legislation, House Bill 4038, was brought up about in the fall of 2015 that basically was going to create a number of bureaucratic hurdles so that refugees from Syria who might be resettled in the United States were then going to have to get approved by about 4 or 5 different agencies. And effectively, it was going to mean that they weren't going to be able to come. It would take about 10 years or so for them to get here. And then much more recently, you're probably aware, there were 2 executive orders from President Trump. The first one, people refer to them sometimes as the Muslim ban, but what he was doing was really banning people from certain countries. And these are countries that were predominantly Muslim and Arab countries. Part of that ban, though, was a specific exclusion of all Syrian refugees. So they were just going to not allow Syrian refugees to come in, even ones that even had their visas. So it's been a huge issue. That's one side of it. The other side of the debate here in the United States is the people that believe that the United States has refugee laws. We do. We've had established. We signed on to conventions from the UN, and then we had our own laws established in 1980. We have very clear laws about letting in refugees. So the debate kind of goes both ways, and we're very much part of it, and this is very much happening today. But what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Europe is completely different. The borders to Syria and Turkey make Europe accessible. Dangerous, yes, but accessible. Okay, you can go the route through the Balkans. Okay, yes, there's some fences up now. There is the sea. It is dangerous, but there's a sea. When refugees from Syria get on a boat and they travel to Turkey, then they get on the boat and they make it to Greece, they're what's often referred to as a spontaneous refugee. That is that they're not planned. Greece has not signed paperwork and welcomed them in already. They show up there. The terminology is complicated, but they're technically called asylum seekers. And once they go through a kind of a legal process, they might be granted refugee status. Right? The terminology is, in the legal aspect of it, is kind of complicated. But basically, they're spontaneous. They arrive there. Okay? This makes states very, very nervous because they're not controlling who's coming in. Okay? This is irregular migration, irregular refugee processes. That's what's happened in Europe. That's not what happens in the United States. There's really no way a Syrian can get to the United States without going through border control somehow. And you're not passing through border control unless you have the paperwork that says you are already accepted as a refugee. Every Syrian refugee who has come to the United States has gone through an incredibly thorough vetting process. It takes somewhere between a year, 2 years. Some people say 3 years. I don't think it usually takes that long. But they go through its immense process in paperwork. They're not spontaneous. They're planned. So to say that we're having the same experience, and some people will make an argument that's happening in Europe, is actually pretty inaccurate. Okay? So the spontaneous arrivals is a very different thing. Number-wise, since the war started, up until the end of 2016, so a few more months, we've taken in 16,000 Syrian refugees. All right. I looked this up just a couple hours ago. Enrollment in GRCC is 17,890. So there's more students enrolled in GRCC than there are Syrian refugees in the entire country. Right? So I think when there's sometimes a lot of hysteria and a lot of concern about Syrian refugees, we're talking about a tiny number of people. Country just to our north, Canada, they've accepted 60,000 Syrian refugees. Right? So we've taken in incredibly, incredibly small numbers of them. And I think this is not what I want. I'm not going to talk about this for the rest of the talk, but I think this context is really important because we're living this right now. All right, this is very much, these are debates that are going to continue and that have been happening here, and they're going to continue. Although both the executive orders were stopped by judges, I mean, the process is going to continue. It's not over. It's not over yet. Okay, so what I do want to do for the rest of my talk, I think, again, that context and understanding, what that does is kind of tell you, this is really relevant to think about what's going on with Syrian refugees, because this is actually part of our politics today. But what I want to do is kind of move away a little bit from that and kind of bring Fatima back into my talk. All right. I think in our headline news, we see things I was just talking about. We hear stories of, people, the boats capsizing and people dying. We hear statistics about that. We hear that there's 900,000 refugees seeking, 900 Syrians seeking refuge in Europe. We hear that there's 16,000 here in the United States, things like this. But we don't get the stories of a woman being scared of mice. Okay? We don't get that type of depth when we read most of our headlines. So what I want to do is I'm going to tell you stories. I'm going to do basically what I did with Fatima, but I'm going to tell you 4 more stories about different women I met. And again, I interviewed, it was well over 50 and a lot of stories. I was picking and choosing which ones to tell. But I'm going to tell 4 more stories. And I'm doing this, and as I do it, I'm going to highlight for you things I did with Fatima, both of the unbelievable obstacles and challenges they have, but also ways that they have been so successful and so strong. Okay? And I have to do that in part to show that refugees do not equal burden on society, that they have so many abilities, they have so much hope, and that they're people who are scared of mice and they want to go to college. Okay? They're just people. And by doing this, the ultimate goal is to humanize Syrian refugees. And maybe refugees more broadly, and maybe just people more broadly. But the whole goal of this is really just dehumanize people. Do you guys have any questions before I move on? I know I went through some pretty controversial stuff in that last slide. More than happy. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so going back to the United States accepting a small number of refugees, one of the reasons be because of our president and our people in the country being afraid of terrorism maybe happening in our country?
Yeah, I think his question was, in some reason, why it's been a small number is because people are concerned about terrorism. I mean, a lot of the reason is because of geographical proximity, and they just don't have the ability to get here. But the debates do, in a lot of ways, come down to terrorism. And there's refugees and terrorism have nothing to do with each other. It's mind-boggling to me that these two terms get conflated and get used together in the same sentence. These are people who are, lost their homes and their farms and their livelihoods, and they're seeking a place to live. There's no relation to terrorism with a refugee. Okay? There are terrorists in Syria who do really horrible, awful, disgusting things, but they're not the same thing as a refugee. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. All right. So Jordan, where the four women are living, would tell the stories. Real quickly here, there's 657,000 Syrian refugees living in Jordan. Okay, less than Turkey, less than Lebanon, but still a very large number. This is in a country of about 6 million people, of which half of them are Palestinian refugees. Jordan has quite an amazing kind of domestic internal politics when it comes to refugees. Okay, so 6 million people living there, close, not quite, but 700,000 or so Syrian refugees. Half their population are already Palestinian refugees. Now, the photographs I showed you, and I mentioned Zatri refugee camp, it's located up here in the northern part of Jordan, relatively close to the Syrian border. The Zatri refugee camp now has a little under 80,000 people there. At its height in 2014, it had 120,000. All right, the number's gone down by 40,000 because conditions living in Zatri are so deplorable that people flee. They leave. They want to get out of the camp. It's not a good place to live. Right? So the camp is actually down to 80,000. When it was at the higher number, it was actually the second largest refugee camp in the entire world. The first one, the largest, is in Kenya. It doesn't have that status anymore now that it's that low, but still, it's a huge camp. It's a very, very large camp. There are two other main camps in Jordan for Syrian refugees, but they're not the size of Zatri, and I actually hadn't been to the other ones, but there are other camps. Okay. Now, where are everybody else? I mean, if so many people left, 80% of Syrian refugees just live in the cities, in the villages, and the towns. The town of Mafraq is the one that Zatri is actually close to. A lot have just come to live in Mafraq, but the large majority of them in the capital city of Amman, which is a bit to the south, or in Erbil. And Erbil is a city that's a little bit further north. And I did research in both those cities, in Erbil as well as in Amman, with the urban refugees. And that's frequently what we call a refugee who does not live in a camp. We call them an urban refugee. Even if they're living in something that's a little bit more rural, we often refer to them as an urban refugee. Now, they get out in Jordan. Jordan has very specific laws that controls how refugees move in their country. And in Jordan, they have what is called, it's a bailout system. So basically what they need, a Syrian refugee needs a Jordanian family to agree to kind of sponsor them. It's a sponsorship system. I think that's the word I put up there. Yep, it is. They need them actually to be sponsored, and that basically means that they will help them find accommodations, they can help them with food and things along that line. And that's how Syrian refugees can live actually in Jordan and not be in the campus through that sponsorship system. And as I'm going to tell you when I talk about these women again, it's incredibly difficult. If you can only imagine what it'd be like if someone came and started bombing Michigan and you all had to flee. What you do. It's incredibly difficult, but again, it's the resiliences I want to point out as well here. So I'm going to start in the Zatri refugee camp. I'm going to tell you two stories with two more women. Fatima was in Zatri. I'm going to tell you stories about two more women in the Zatri refugee camp, but just to give you a little bit more image about the camp, or a little more idea about the camp first. There is one street in Zatri which is kind of known as the commercial district, and it's amazing because they're not allowed to work and sell goods, but it is just little marketplace and little shop for shop for shop. There's probably got to be 20 different places to get falafel. You can get plastic stuff from China. You can get lingerie in the market here. Basically, the officials just turn a blind eye to it. They recognize that people need a livelihood. They need to work. They need to do these things. So they keep it going. And it's probably this. Maybe it's about a quarter. No, maybe not quite that long. But I mean, it's a decent length of a street and tons of commerce going here. And then above that, you see what was generally referred to as kind of the Free Army flag. That's not the Assad regime's flag, but that is the Syrian flag that has been modified a little bit to represent the resistance movement. So you see a lot of those in the camps as well. There are people in the camps that are regime supporters. They're usually a little bit more quiet and subtle about it because the majority of the Syrians living here typically are supporting the resistance movement. And this is another side of the camp, another angle of the camp. Some families do live in these tents, okay, which is a pretty classic UNHCR. The UNHCR is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That's what that stands for. It's the official body. It's the one, when I use the statistic of 13.5 million registered refugees, those refugees are actually registered with the UNHCR. So this is a typical tent. This tent was actually used, this wasn't used for sleeping, this was actually more of like a living room space that a family was using. But when a lot of refugees first get there, before they kind of get the system and get a lot of the aid they need, they will sleep in tents like this for a month, maybe 2-3 months at a time. And then often they will get upgraded into one of those trailers you see in the back, those white square trailers, which are the same things that they had the schools. And I'll show you another example of one that's actually a beauty salon as well. But this is a major space of living. And you can also see in the background there's a lot of fencing and barbed wire, right? And that is because once a Syrian refugee is in this camp, they're not allowed to freely move out of it. They need to get sponsored by a Jordanian family to leave the camp. So it's not a stretch to say it actually functions like a prison. No Syrian refugee can get out of there without the proper paperwork saying they can get out. So it is highly securitized, it's highly fortified like this. There's sand berms surrounding the entire camp, which functions as like a huge sand dune. And if you've ever heard of a sand dune before, it's difficult. And then beyond the sand berms, they have occasionally spaced tanks as more of a symbol. I've never used them, but it's more of a symbol of this is something that's been militarized and securitized, and people here are more or less stuck there until they get the proper paperwork. Okay. So in one of those trailers, I mentioned there's a lot of aid agencies in the Zatri refugee camp. One of them is called the Qatar Red Crescent. This is actually part of the larger Red Cross system from Switzerland that we're familiar with here in the United States as well. So in the Qatar Red Crescent, they embody some of the same principles that you would expect with the Red Cross. It's about humanitarian aid. It's about treating medical conditions. It's about supporting people who need support. And I got to know a couple of the women who visited the Qatar Red Crescent on occasion. This woman here is Juma. She was another one of those women, just, some people really get to you, and she was another one of those women that's really got to me. She's 36 years old, at least she was in 2014. She's 36 years old, she has 6 children. Juma came to the Qatar Red Crescent a couple times a week where she met with other Syrian refugee women where they were embroidering. And that's what you actually see this picture here. The Qatar Red Crescent was able to find them cloth and thread, and they would get together a couple times a week, and they would make these beautiful, this is crocheting here, but they would actually crochet these little flowers, and then they would sew them onto scarves. And they would do other type of embroidery. This would be embroidering work over here. And then what they would do is every quarter, so 4 times a year, there would be a bazaar, fair of sorts in the camp where they would sell these goods. And they did this to supplement their income because they didn't really have much of an income. And it became very important work for them in the sense they did get a little bit of money, but they also began to socialize. They actually began to laugh and have fun and to talk to other people. And it was through processes like that they actually began to deal with a lot of their trauma. Okay? So I talked to Juma for quite a bit about a lot of different things. Oh, I hit the wrong button again here. Oh, I'm still hitting the wrong one. I talked to her about a lot of different things. So Juma, as though we see her here doing this kind of handicraft kind of work here, she had a bachelor's degree in English. Okay, and she had got it, 16, 17 years, no, maybe 15 years ago while she was still in Syria. But she never worked a day in her life. She got her bachelor's degree. She was actually married before she finished her degree. But as soon as she finished her degree, she stayed at home. She took care of her husband and then her 6 children. She never actually worked. When she got to Zatri camp and she did things like this embroidering, she also was out of the need to cope and to care for her family. She decided to put her degree to use. So she started tutoring English to little kids in the camp. So she started helping these kids in the camp to learn English. She got a tiny little bit of money. She didn't take much because she was taking money from refugees. But a teeny tiny little bit of money from families, and she taught kids. She started to use this degree that she had never used a day in her life. It was amazing for her to do this, and it was something that she found challenging, but rewarding. And rewarding again because of the small income, because she was doing kind of outreach work with other people, but also because she was using as part of her brain and her intellect she hadn't really been using before. And this was a really important thing for Juma. It was a really important thing for a lot of the different women I talked to. Right. I don't have a picture of Layla, so it sometimes can be very inappropriate to photograph people in situations like this. So sometimes I'll just show you pictures of buildings. So Layla, when I interviewed her, also in 2014 in the Za'atari refugee camp, she was 21 years old. She looked like she was 15 though. They were all very emotional stories. She was 21 years old. She was single. She was one of the very few women I met that did not have kids or that was single. She lived with her family in one of the actual more tent structures that was actually close to this picture, this photograph right here, but a little bit further behind it. I met her in this building right here, which is a beauty salon. Okay, this trailer right here. In this trailer, it's probably about 10 feet by 20. They're 10 feet by 20 feet. You can see here, it's just got one window in here. It's got bars on the window. It's stifling hot. Okay, I was doing this research in July in the desert in northern Jordan. I mean, it's incredibly hot. It was stifling hot in there. When you walk into that trailer, they had one wall that was their nails wall, and they had another wall that was their hair wall. And it was a pretty busy place. In this photograph here, it's closed. But when we were in there, it was busy. They were laughing. They were socializing, like Juma was doing in the Qatar Red Crescent. They were having a good time talking to each other. They were doing things that were very therapeutic, trying to deal with the stress and trauma. Layla was also earning a little bit of money. Layla, also being 21 years old, she lost the opportunity to go to college. She wanted to study computer science. In fact, unlike Fatima, she had actually been accepted to college. And I think she had just started college. She had taken maybe like just a couple classes in studying computer science in Syria when the war broke out. But she lost her opportunity. And that's part of what being displaced and being a refugee is. She lost her opportunity to follow school. When I interviewed her and I talked to her, she spoke about depression more than I think she did. She spoke about depression more than most of the women I talked to. She talked about how she thought about killing herself. She thought about how she was going to go back to Syria and wait for someone to drop a bomb on her house so she could die. She lived with debilitating guilt because some of her family was still in Syria, and she felt like she left them. She deserted her family who was still in Syria to come here. She was dealing with a lot of trauma. And she was very vocal about it, more so than a lot of people. But she said that this work and having a job, making a teeny tiny little bit of money, was so therapeutic for her, and it helped her so much because of the little tiny income. But it kept her mind. It let her mind get distracted with doing something else. It let her socialize again. I know I've mentioned that many times, but it ended up being incredibly important to Layla that she was able to work. I don't know if I put a quote up here from her. No, I didn't. Okay. But I don't want to sugarcoat it, because it's actually not a very pretty story at all. Okay? Working gave her some sense of, kind of bring life back to her in some ways. But she worked at a beauty salon, and this beauty salon was very busy. And this beauty salon was very busy because a lot of marriages happen in the Za'atari refugee camp. This is a wedding dress that was out to air. A different day. The previous picture showed you the dress wasn't out. This was a different day when I came back here. This wedding dress was out to air because there's only a certain number of wedding dresses that are in the Za'atari refugee camp. So women share them. They basically kind of rent them for the wedding, and then they get cleaned. They go back to the beauty salon. They get cleaned. And then they go to the beauty salon. They get dressed, and their nails get done. Their hair get done. So Layla was working usually with brides. Okay? Most of the people that came to the salon were brides. And that is because when you're in these extreme situations and you're coping, marriage happens much more frequently. Young girls get married at incredibly young ages. Okay, Syria, the country of Jordan has a law. I think it's 18, and Syria does as well. That you're not supposed to get married young. People do it all the time. It happens very frequently. But they're trying to stop early marriages. But it happens in these cases where a family feels like they can't support their daughter, and a young man comes in saying, I can support your daughter, they're often likely to get married at a very early age. And this happens in an incredibly heightened way during times of crisis like this. So I'd like to be a little bit romantic and say that some of the weddings were happening out of love and by choice, but the reality of it is the number of marriages that were happening in the Za'atari refugee camp because of desperation and because they were just trying to cope were actually probably outnumbered them immensely. So this wedding dress, Layla said, I think they had 4 in rotation, and this is the only one I ever saw because they were being used so frequently. Right? So there's a very serious side to how women particularly get treated. It's gender-based violence. There's a very specific ways in which women get affected during war that's very different than men. And getting married off at very early ages is part of it. Often they're marrying men who are much, much older than them as well. In the case of Zatri, there's also there's been a lot of reports of wealthier men coming from Gulf countries and coming in and marrying women and then divorcing them very soon after the wedding night. So there's been extreme cases of immense amount of gender exploitation and gender-based violence happening in the camp. So there are some good things happening in the sense of resilience here, but again, I don't want to sugarcoat this. All right, and I need to hurry up a little bit. Outside the camp, I did a lot of interviews with urban refugees. Urban refugees, for the most part, live in very, very, very modest accommodations. They live in apartments that look like this. I interviewed this woman who I'll talk about in a few minutes, Senna. I interviewed her in an apartment up here. They're very modest apartments, but they're manageable. They're better than the camp, without a doubt here. Why they want to be here is because they're not in a camp/prison anymore. They have mobility. They have so much more independence. They have a lot more freedom. But at the same time, when you leave the camp, you leave your aid organizations. You don't have a Qatar Red Crescent around the corner to help supply you with the materials to do the embroidery like Juma was. Okay, I went to many houses that. I went to a lot of houses that you could tell were very lacking because they no longer were receiving the aid from the UNHCR like they were receiving as directly. They still can receive aid from when they're urban refugees, but it's more difficult. There's more obstacles for them. Okay, so 2 women I met urban. Asma. This woman had more fire to her than I think any woman I've ever met in my life, any person in my life. Asma was divorced by her husband about a year before the war broke out. She has 6 children. She was just like Juma. She was the same thing as Juma. She's 36 years old and she had 6 children. That's when I interviewed her about a year and a half ago. She was divorced from her husband before the war even started. When she fled Syria, she fled alone. Well, she fled with her 6 children, but it was her and her 6 children. She already had a brother in Jordan, so she felt like there was going to be a support system for her when she got to Jordan, but she did the fleeing on her own. She gets to Jordan with her 6 children. She finds a very probably one of the more dilapidated apartments I had been in. But she finds an apartment, and she's like, okay, I need to support myself, all right? Asma has a lot of talents. She's a seamstress and does beadwork. She made this dress. Okay, she made this dress, all while caring for her kids. This is one of her kids over here. Asma also started her very own beauty salon, okay, in the town of Erbil. She had her own salon, okay? So she was at the salon sometimes. She was at home doing this. She also did a lot of cooking. Particularly, she pickled vegetables, and she would sell pickled vegetables. I mean, you name it, she did it. And she did all this stuff while taking care of her 6 kids. And that's impressive. It's mind-blowing that a woman can accomplish this many things. But at the same time, it was immensely difficult for her. She had so many struggles because of this. She didn't have time for her kids. And a lot of women told me this. They continually said things like, oh, my kids are misbehaving now. I don't have time to spend with my kids. Fatima, the first woman I spoke about when I first started the talk, she had to give up breastfeeding because she had to work. And that was a very, very difficult thing for her to do. And they constantly were saying things like the kids are misbehaving. They even said they don't have time to care for their husbands as properly. The way that they really want to care for their husbands, they don't have time to do these things. It was very challenging for them to be women, to be nurturers, to be mothers and wives while working, doing all these things. And she says because of them, because of her roles, and I heard this sentiment from a lot of women, she said women are now like the men, and the men are like the women, in the sense that they're making money, they have these businesses, they're doing all these things, and they're getting kind of role reversals here. But it's stressful. And it's stressful, anywhere in the world this is going to happen. She says, I got the whole world, all the responsibilities on my shoulders. So it was a very difficult thing for her. As much as impressive and amazing as a woman as she is, it was very difficult for her. Okay, one more quick story, and then we'll just do questions. Senna, I'm Facebook friends with Senna, and I saw on Facebook just maybe 2 months ago now that she just finished her master's degree in clinical psychology. All right. I don't have a photograph of her either. She worked here at this organization called Bright Futures. It's an organization, it's another aid organization in Jordan, and they specifically do work that's supposed to help with counseling, helping with the trauma of war and displacement. She had a clinical psychology degree in Syria, but she never used it in Syria. Okay. When she fled Syria and came to Jordan, she, like these other women, came in a situation where her husband was unable to work. Her husband was an engineer, but he was unable to find work as an engineer in Jordan. But there was such a need, sadly enough, and such a need for her trauma counselors, she was able to find work. So she started working for the first time in her life. I gotta look at my notes real quick here, and I can't remember how many kids she had. She had 5 kids. Okay, she was 32 years old. She had 5 children, and one of them was a baby. Then she was still breastfeeding her child at that time. So she was able, unlike Fatima, she was able to actually make that work. So Sana, though, I mean, just absolutely amazing. The things that she accomplished, and the fact that she came to Jordan, started counseling, working full time, and she went to school to get her master's degree. She did all of that in Jordan. All right, and she was able to do that. She was able to overcome these obstacles. Like most women, this is kind of, I'll wrap up real quickly here. I know we're getting short on time. She was depressed. It's not very surprising. She says she recovered from her depression, though. And what she did is she started to concentrate on building my country instead of crying. And I believe that I have succeeded in this regard. As a counselor, she says, I was able to help more than 150 mothers and 150 injured individuals to have kids. Right? She was helping. She was giving back to that community. She felt like she was doing something very important and very productive. And then she's kind of looking towards the future. This was empowering to her. Okay? She says, realizing all the things she's accomplished, she says, my role was effective and I will not stop here. And she didn't. And she went on to get her master's degree. All right, so she's not stopping. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up here with one quick slide. I'll skip over that one. I really want to tell the story of these women because they amaze me. It was a very important part of my research career to meet these women and hear about their strengths. So I really want to talk about these women. And I don't want to generalize and say they're all the same because they're not. These women have very different experiences. Not all women were like Sana and able to get a master's degree. Okay, some of them that dealt with the depression in very different ways. Okay. They all had strengths and they all had struggles. There's no doubt about it. But these women overall were just incredibly resilient. And then to put it back into a little bit more context, some of the other things I talked about when I wasn't talking about the women, trying to understand the relevance of this. We are right now, whether in Europe or in the United States, talking about these things. We're at a time where the discourses and the practices about humanitarianism, which are enshrined in so many different policies, so many different laws, so many different ideologies and religions, have come into tension and even a contradiction with the idea of security and fear. The question about terrorism, like this is fear, okay? That tension between these two things is in so many ways is kind of formed the political discourse that we're seeing now, again, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States, okay? Well, what I'm hoping to do is kind of to step back, kind of put the stories of these women's lives, these simple stories about being afraid of mice, losing the opportunity to breastfeed, whatever it might be with these women's lives, and just kind of realize that these are people. And it means the most basic humanitarianism 101 type of material that when you actually relate to one person as another person, that barriers break down. And you begin to understand other people. These women grew up in very different places than I did. They have different norms and different cultural norms than I do, but I related to them on so many levels. I'm a mother as well. We could talk about our children. We could talk to Sana about going to college and going for advanced degrees. They're just people. They're just like us. They're just people. And when we humanize people, hopefully you break down those barriers. And that is all. That is all. This, I should have mentioned, this painting here, a woman that I interviewed, she had this in her house. She said it was like a niece's friend, something like that. But yeah, this was actually a photograph I took of a painting in someone's house.
It's really interesting that this crisis sparked for these women really, in many ways, a much higher sense of empowerment than they would have experienced had they remained in Syria.
Yep. It's sometimes in literature it's referred to as being the coping economy, that these in dire circumstances have created a time and place in which they had to cope, and they did it in some economic ways. You hope that's not the way you get empowered, but it's been happening.
You don't. Here you go.
How many days were you able to spend so much time with those women?
It was a series of different trips. My first research trip there in 2014, I spent the majority of the summer there. I took my family along with me, at least for part of it. I also had students with me. It's complicated. I brought a group of students with me as well as my family. So I spent a good portion of that summer 2014. And then 2015, I went for a short amount of time, it was about 2 weeks, to do follow-up interviews. Okay, that's what's here. I had done research in Jordan for years before with other people as well, though. But with the Syrians, it was maybe about, what was that? I guess it was 8 weeks the first summer and then 2 weeks the following summer. of them. Some of them. So Sana, I am, and that's a pseudonym as well. That's not her real name. I'm Facebook friends with two of the women who, and one of them is who I call Sana, and one other woman who both worked for Bright Futures, that organization. And then my research assistant, I had a research team of 3 people. She's in Jordan, she's Jordanian, and I keep in touch with her a lot. And so she's able to update me sometimes on some of the women. That's good. Yeah. I hope to go back. I hope to go back, and my plan is to actually give them drafts of things that I'm writing to have them read prior to me disseminating them. That's my hope. Kind of. It was difficult work. It was difficult work.
Okay, so concerning, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I know like the camp in Kenya kind of ignores it and is probably not planning to do anything with it.
They actually
But-
tried to close it down recently.
Yeah. So in Jordan, they have the sponsorship program to help get the refugees out of there. But is it their plan overall, like their government plan to get everyone out of the camp and close it? And how old is it? And so what does Jordan see as the future of this camp and these people?
I don't know if the camp particularly, what they want to do with it long term. I mean, no one really wants the refugee camp there. But at the same time, Jordan is an impoverished country. Their citizens have a hard time finding jobs. So having that influx of Syrians there is a real strain on their economy. I have a ton of Jordanian friends that, they recognize, there's actually really a big study done by Yarmouk University, which is a large university in Jordan, that looked at Jordanian perceptions of the Syrians. And there was this amazing sense of yes, they need to be here. We have to help them. They're fellow Arabs. They're for the most part often fellow Muslims, and not all Muslims, but I mean, a lot of them are. And there's a very sense yes, we have to have them here, but it's such a strain. It's just so hard. So I don't think I don't think they have a clear policy, but the long-term plan is. A lot of it comes down to the international refugee system is a disaster. It's not functioning well. In Jordan, they're doing so much for the refugees, but I don't really know if there's a plan what to do with the camp. The camp was planned, though, when the refugee crisis started. They said, this is the plotted territory, let's do it. They planned it. Most refugee camps happen kind of in a kind of ad hoc, kind of de facto, kind of random way, but this one was actually very, very planned. Yeah. But I don't know. I don't think they know long term what they're doing. They're kind of. Yeah, I haven't heard anything about them trying to close it down. Like the Ob camp in Kenya, yeah, they're trying to close that down. I haven't heard that, anything like that.
Okay, you did hit on the sponsorship.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to know how much these people they do with the sponsorship.
The Jordanians who sponsor. Okay, her question was, the Jordanians who choose to sponsor a family, what do they actually do? It varies a lot, depends on the family. I've heard the bad side of the story that a Jordanian family will agree to sponsor because they know the Syrian family will just give them, maybe give them some dinar, some money, and then they ignore them and they never pay attention to them again. And then there's the other side of the story where they build them a house in their backyard and they look after them and they figure out a way to get their kids to school and educate them. I think there's a huge spectrum of how it happens.
Okay, for you personally, did you experience any type of culture shock, and how welcoming were the people towards you?
She asked if I experienced culture shock and how welcoming people were to me. No, I had traveled through Arab countries and Muslim countries quite a bit before, so I think I'm relatively acclimated to that. And I have been to Jordan a lot before. I went through shock going to the Zartri refugee camp, not because of culture necessarily, but because it was horrible. It was a very, very, to know that these people were living there and I was passing through as some privileged American white woman, that was the difficult aspect of it. They were incredibly welcoming to me, amazing. The people invited me to their homes that I know they couldn't really feed their kids. They didn't have enough money to give their kids meat once a week, but they gave me Hostess cupcakes, Coca-Cola, which things are very expensive. They treated me so generously, so warmly, so openly. There's a hospitality that happens, I think, in Jordan and Syria. I've seen it in Egypt, I've seen it in Morocco, that is unparalleled to anywhere I've ever been before. Yeah, very warm, very welcoming.
Okay, so as far as the different like refugee policies that you've seen, what ones do you think are the most effective? Like in Jordan, obviously like the sponsorship and stuff is really cool, but it kind of sucks that they have to stay so confined. So like, I mean, I guess how would that compare to other places you've seen? And what do you think ideally would be like the best way to bring refugees and introduce them into a society?
That's a good question. Believe it, I mean, that is a hot topic, you know, and people are debating this because this, I mean, the refugee system, it's a disaster. There are a handful of people who have been talking about transnationalism, about kind of global citizenship for a very long time. And there are some people that then take those ideas and they're transferring them to refugee and migrant populations. And I don't think it would work everywhere, but I think open borders and recognizing that citizenship doesn't have to be something that's necessarily tied to a territorial state is what's going to make this actually work. That we need to get over these boundaries that we have on states and just kind of realize global citizenship is something that can actually happen. Borders and countries are a very new part of our history of the world. These things did not exist for very long. And you know, if they're new, why can't we break them down? So I feel like refugee laws would be much better if we had much more open borders, much more open boundaries, and we're able to grant people rights of citizenship even if they weren't in their territorial state. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a utopian idea. I think people might say that's not very practical or realistic right now, but the other options are not working as well. Really not. And it depends. The context is super important. You know, what Jordan and Turkey, for example, are able to do with Syrians is to have relatively open borders. I mean, yes, there's the camp once you get in there, but actually coming in is actually relatively open. So they're doing something. They're pretty open, at least.
Hi.
Hi.
So you were able to go into the refugee camp.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have to be invited? Could you only stay one day? Could you go in and out? Just kind of like from someone who's not from Jordan. How did you do that?
Yeah, to get into Zatri, I needed very specific paperwork, and it was not easy to get. It took me months to get the approval to be able to go in there. Yeah, it was a very long process. There's an official process you go through. I went through it. I was ignored. I wasn't rejected, but it just was like, it wasn't ever looked at. So because I was fortunate enough to have done work with Palestinian refugees, I knew some people who were kind of in the community, and I was able to get some help and assistance, and basically someone was able to circumvent one particular desk and get me to a brigadier general, literally. And because the camp is actually run by the Army. The security is the Army, so he was able to get me in. But yeah, otherwise it's very difficult it's difficult to get in. It's also difficult to get out though. Yeah, but it took some time. It took some time to do that. It was patience. There's a lot of patience involved with that.
Only have time for one or two more questions, and have one question right here.
Okay. I know the focus of your talk has been mostly on the women refugees. I was wondering if you could, what kind of emotional toll it's been on the men who were usually the breadwinners and very patriarchal and things like that to suddenly not be in charge anymore, how that was affecting people.
Yeah, and I did not interview men specifically. I talked to lots of them, but they weren't technically part of my data, you know, so to speak. I hate to use that word though because I think of these as people. I hate to say that, but anyways. So tensions. There are a lot of tensions in the household. You can only imagine, Sena's husband was an engineer. You can't find work. He can't work in Jordan. And that's going to be, amazingly difficult. And then he also feels like in some ways he's losing his dignity. I heard the women talked about their husbands a lot. And the idea like they lost their dignity, that they can't provide for their family anymore, it made them feel as though they were inadequate. And it led to even further depression. Sometimes it led to violence, the gender-based violence that I kind of mentioned very briefly at the end. That was another thing that happened. The domestic violence actually in the household setting often increases during times of crisis and displacement because there's depression, there's anger over your lack of ability to supply or provide for your family. So this has a huge effect on them, particularly their inability to work. So maybe the refugee policy, what first needs to happen is countries need to allow refugees to work in some ways. But Jordan doesn't have a lot of job. They're doing their best.
So,
Okay.
was it normal for the women that you came across to have gone to school to receive education, not use it? And also, are any of these refugee camps considering taking outside sponsorships from families who might want to sponsor these refugees?
So the women education question, I would say, oh goodness, I know I have it written down. Probably 2/3 of them had some type of education. So Dera, the town that the actual war erupted in, the one that Fatima was from as well, is a very, very rural place. And women who came from Dera often were not educated, but most other women were. If they were from Damascus or Aleppo or Homs, I mean, yeah, most of them were educated, but very few of them worked. A couple of them, when they did work in Syria prior to the war, their income was always supplementary. They usually referred to it as like their play money, where they could just go shopping with it, they could buy clothes or whatever they want. It was not part of like the family household income. It was just a supplementary income. Did I answer your question about that? Education? Well, yeah, they were, I mean, yeah, but I began to want to interview and specifically try to interview women who were working, and a lot of those women might have been more likely to be educated. My sample was not representative. I was not seeking some representative sample of Syrian women. I was seeking women and interviewing women who had doing some type of work, handicrafts or whatever, working at an NGO or working as a teacher. So, I mean, my sample was definitely biased, but that was intentional. And then the question about families sponsoring people in the camp, I've never heard of that happening. I don't think there's a lot of families that want to sponsor to begin with. And I think if they do want to sponsor, they want to sponsor outside of the camp. I don't think it's, yeah. I mean, people, if they want to donate money, there are so many ways to donate money to those camps, but I don't think sponsorship happens within the camps. I've never heard of that, at least. Yeah.
Well, please give another round of applause for Karen. It's just